So yeah, I'm a professor at UConn in the communication department specifically. And so my research is all about communication technology, how we use it to communicate, how it changes how we communicate. For about 16 years now, that's mostly been social media. So one thing I will say right up front is that there's a lot going on with social media all the time, right? So social media has been around about 20 years now. And we have a lot of researchers working on a lot of things that are happening. Things move fast, they change fast. There's a lot of questions and so on. So there's no way I can cover everything that's happening in, let's say, 45 minutes. So what I'm going to do is just kind of highlight some of the main things that are happening right now, some of the ideas that we have right now, some of the issues and solutions that we're kind of grappling with right now. So I certainly don't have all the answers to everything, but I can talk about what the focus is right now. And I'm very excited to hear your questions at the end. We can absolutely have more of a conversation about any of these things. Like I said, these are going to be highlights. All right, so just to get us all on the same page, I'm sure that many of you are social media users. And in fact, I know Rachel said that you can ask questions in the chat. Feel free to also respond in the chat. So with social media usage, right, I'll throw some questions out there for you to kind of think about. And if you just want to type up some of those responses in the chat, so I can kind of see where you are with your usage and the things that you do and what you like and know. So this is just a chart from Edison does these reports every year. So this is the latest for 2023 the social media usage in the US for those 12 and over. And I should say that, again, most of my research and the research I'm focused on here is US focused. So in other countries, it might certainly be somewhat different. But we can see, not surprising, right? This chart starts at 2008, moves into 2023. So 15 years of data. Not surprising, we see this growth. What I think is kind of interesting is that we actually haven't seen much growth since about 2017 in terms of how much people are using social media. So in the last few years, we've really leveled off, even with, if we remember back to 2020, kind of that early pandemic time when a lot of people were using social media to connect, to find out information, to socialize. Even that didn't really drive social media use up more than it already was. So we're at about 80% of the US population using social media. So you can let me know if you're in the chat, if you're a social media user. And also specifically which apps or platforms you use. So we tend to call these platforms because sometimes they're apps, sometimes they're websites, sometimes they're mobile applications, sometimes they're websites. Most of these now are more and more mobile applications. But if you joined social media a long time ago, like I did, those were just websites you went to on your computer. And so if we look overall, we see, so the different things represented here are Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, which is now called X, but that's a whole different story, Snapchat, Pinterest, and then other apps. And so you kind of just see visually what's going on here. So Facebook still is the biggest one, meaning most of people who are social media users, they have the biggest portion of those users. But when we look by age, as you start to look down this chart from younger users, and I'm not sure if you can see my little pointer or not, but younger users are shifting a lot away from Facebook, right? So oldest users are very much in this Facebook space, whereas going into middle age, sort of shifting a little bit more, but the youngest users are really mostly over on Instagram and TikTok. And I know that there are a lot of questions probably right now about those two apps specifically and what they're doing and what kind of effects they're having. And that is certainly where the research is going right now, trying to figure those out and how those are different than Facebook. So again, in the chat, if you want, you can let me know which apps you use, which ones you know, which ones you're not familiar with. And then certainly at the end of this, if there's questions about any of these, we can talk about those more specifically. So I have a few different sections in here. And I want to cover really kind of three things. So first of all, just what shapes our social media experience. So as we go into an app, what is it that's happening that drives what we're doing there and how we feel about things. Then looking at some of those effects. So what are the main effects that we're thinking about with individuals? And then also the effects that we're thinking about on a more societal level. And then finally, sort of what do we do with that? You know, what's the best thing that we know right now about how to maybe use social media effectively, the things we should be concerned about, and then also the things that maybe we don't need to be quite so concerned about. So I have kind of three things, and trust me, this took a lot of me trying to boil this down into a few key points, because there's, again, so much that we've studied about what are all the factors that influence how we use social media, how it influences us, you know, how it's designed. And again, that's always changing as well. And so I come from a psychology background actually originally. And so a lot of this is really psychology, right? These sites are designed to play on our psychology about how we interact, how we seek information, what entertains us. So these sites are really tapping into that. So there's a lot going on here, but I think for the sake of having some important takeaways, I'll just highlight three things that I think are really important to what's shaping this experience for us. So the first is something called algorithms. And again, in the chat, you could say, you know, do you know what an algorithm is? Or you could define an algorithm, because there's a lot of variability in what people understand about algorithms right now. So an algorithm is basically a formula. And in the case of social media, it's a formula that determines what it is that shows up in our feed. So if you're on Facebook, kind of scrolling through, right, you see posts from maybe your own friends, you see a news post, a random video comes up, a local business advertises something, and how do all those things get in your feed? Some of those things you might follow, some of those might be people you know, and then other things you might think, where did that come from? So this is the formula that's trying to decide what to show you. The thing about these algorithms is that they are, I kind of say they're like the Coke secret formula, excuse me, that we don't know what they are, and they won't release them. So Facebook's never going to tell us exactly what their formula is. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, all these apps are never going to say exactly what it is. So this diagram, and you certainly don't need to focus too much on the details of this, but if you kind of follow the path down, what it's showing you is here's a potential algorithm, right? Somebody posts a video, and I think this was somebody trying to sort of reverse engineer the TikTok algorithm. So someone posts a video, it goes to viewers, and then depending on how the viewer engages in that, it gets some sort of performance rating. So this video was good, the person liked it, this person didn't like it, and so it's not good. And then that builds into the formula. So then the algorithm will decide, okay, who do we show this to next? Should we show this person more videos like this? And so here's some other examples. So Facebook's newsfeed algorithm is very vaguely a formula that says how something is determined to show up in your newsfeed is some combination of whether you have an interest in that page or that account, how well that specific post has done. Has it received a lot of likes and shares and comments? How well has that page or account done? What's the type of content? How new is it? And again, we don't know the exact numbers here, but we know that this is vaguely what's happening. Same with Instagram, right? Very similar ideas. And most of the social media algorithms operate on these similar ideas. You're going to see stuff that's newer, that's more popular, that has something to do with how you engaged in that content before. So that's one big piece. And right now there's a lot of focus on this because a lot of us are trying to figure out how these algorithms work and whether anyone can understand what they're doing and how they influence us. So a piece that follows from this is engagement. I would say this is sort of my second big buzzword of what shapes how we experience social media. And part of this is marketing driven. This is a lot of what people want when they're on social media creating content, right? So us, if let's say you're a user of social media, but you're not necessarily posting, or you're not using it to try to do any kind of marketing or promote your business. You're maybe just consuming content and engaging with that. But if you are, so say if you're a business owner or you're trying to be influential in some way online, the thing that you're always looking for is this idea of engagement. So a very buzzword kind of thing. And again, every site will measure this a little bit differently. But we see things, these are a bunch of visual indicators of what we might see. On the left, you see the Instagram hearts. So if there's a post that you like, that's what that's going to look like. Facebook has these reactions that are at the top. So we have, all these ways that you can indicate that you liked a post, that it made you laugh, that you were shocked by it. Twitter, Twitter is in a lot of flux right now. That's something we can also talk about. But for the most part, again, you can like it, you can share it, which is the retweet. You can mention somebody else. LinkedIn adopted something similar where we have, you can like a post, you can celebrate it. Say if somebody says, hey, I got a new job. Love, insightful, curious. So there's all these different reactions, but it essentially comes down to liking or some sort of emotional reaction, sharing. So you take a piece of content you see and you reshare that to your network. Or you reply in some way, right? You leave a comment, you engage with that somehow. On the right, this was Snapchat. I'm not sure that they do this anymore, but you used to get an emoji to indicate kind of your status on the Snapchat app or how you communicated with people. So this is the second big piece. So any marketer is trying to go for engagement, and it's usually not an end goal because obviously, after engagement, we want, someone to buy a product or to vote or to donate or some kind of other action. But within the social media piece, this is kind of the gold, right? And this is also what partly determines what you're going to see in your feed. So the more you're engaging with stuff, the more you're going to see those kinds of things based, again, on the algorithm. So I think for us as people who are using social media in various ways, the biggest thing I think that shapes a lot of how we end up engaging on social media and a lot of the effects that we could be seeing is this idea called selective self-presentation. And this is, I think, at the root of what so much of the concern is about social media from a psychological or a social perspective. So a lot of the concerns that we have when we say, oh, someone's not presenting their real selves, people are seeing unrealistic images of, the way somebody should look. People are being catfished, if you've heard that term. All of these concerns about, self-esteem, like I said, body image, all these ideas really come back to this idea of selective self-presentation. And so what that really means is, and there's a lot older research on this even than social media, but really once we got online and we were behind the screen, we're able to start presenting ourselves in ways that we can't do offline. So if you meet me offline, you're going to see how I look, and how I look is how I look, and how I talk is how I talk. But online right now, even in this Zoom, I could put a filter on my face. I could put my background's blurred, but I could put a fake background behind me. I could make myself an avatar. So all these things could be emphasizing characteristics that I want you to see and maybe de-emphasizing things I don't want you to see. And this is something that has caused a lot of concern about, for instance, Instagram, like I said, especially for teenagers and teenage girls, when they see these unrealistic depictions. A lot of that right now is the concern of filters, right? Things making people look unrealistically beautiful by some sort of standard, things that are not attainable. So I have this little comic here. It makes a little bit light of it, but basically we see this, kind of old school chatting on the computer, and he says, wow, or the person on the left says, wow, says he's cute with dark eyes and a swimmer's body, and it turns out it's a fish. So not lying, and I think that's the key thing. The selective self-presentation is not outright lying. It's just sort of emphasizing what you want to show off and maybe hiding the things that you don't want to share. One thing that I've heard is that when you go on something like Instagram or really any social media platform, you're kind of seeing everybody's highlight reel, right? And it doesn't really show you the full scope of who they are and what's happening to them and what they're doing every day. So those are the three things that I think underlie a lot of the other things we're talking about. All right. So the question is, what are the effects of all this? And I think this is the question I think it's just always the question, right? So we have social media, we have various ways of using it, but what's happening? What's going on? And this is where the headlines, I think, can be alarming, and we'll talk about some of that. But if you search something like effects of social media and mental health, social media, affects well-being, all of these things, these are the kinds of headlines you might find, right? These are just grabbed quickly. So we see things like, and these are just some examples, so it's not that these are the most important, but just if you search these things, you'll get things about, parental permission for social media because it's considered problematic. Schools, looking to protect students from social media used in marketing, right? How important is it for marketing purposes? Your government being involved in social media. So these are just a few things, but we see these concerns for, students, for marketing, for government. And so there's a lot of questions right now and a lot of concerns and fears about what social media is doing. And so I want to present just some of the things that we know. And so again, this is where I'll back up and say, even if you look up at the research, even if you were to go to a research database and say, okay, but what do researchers definitively find about the effects of social media on well-being? And so well-being is just one outcome. And well-being is sort of what we call the overall, is your life going well, right? Do you have, are you healthy? Are you physically healthy, mentally healthy? Do you have a social support network? Do you feel like you have self-esteem, right? All these things kind of go into, my life is going well. I have a good well-being. And that tends to be the biggest concern with individual effects. So even when you look at the research on this, and I've done this, you will find, no exaggeration, 5,000 studies. So we don't have one answer, but there are things that we're learning more and more over time. So I'm guessing your biggest concern is this would probably be negative, right? So we're using social media too much and we have all these negative effects like self-esteem is low, we're disconnected, maybe there's cyberbullying, these unrealistic expectations and so on. And so, of course, it's more complicated than that. So we do find some of those effects sometimes. But overall, the things that we find, and hopefully this brings some hope, but it's still a complicated picture and we still have to work on it, is that for the most part, when we find these negative effects, they're found for what we call problematic use, not just general use. And what's true so often of the time is that some people are going to be particularly affected by social media, but it is not just a negative thing for everyone all the time. So if you're getting on social media to look up some information sometimes, maybe you use it as entertainment, you're chatting with your friends, that's not automatically going to have a negative effect on you. Research has found time and time again that link just isn't really there the way that we might think. So problematic use is more like, let's say you start really relying on social media for all of your social connection, and you're now maybe no longer socializing with anybody in favor of just being on Instagram and looking at people's videos, right? So now we're in a problematic space, and then yes, that's going to have more negative effects. We do know that depressive symptoms are linked to what we call passive use, whereas active use can actually decrease that. And so one distinction that we make is kind of how you're using social media. So if you're using it passively, we tend to think of that person who, again, maybe is just sort of scrolling through all day, right? Kind of watching everybody else's lives, maybe again, using social media in place of doing some other things. That's where we see more of that link to something like depression. The more actively people use social media, that actually decreases that. Meaning, let's say I use social media to message a friend and have a conversation, or I use social media to share what I'm doing and I get some positive feedback on that. I maybe post some photos and, people enjoy those or something. So something where I'm doing something more active is actually much more positive. There was this interesting study where they actually had people quit Facebook for 2 weeks. So they said, you can't use it at all for 2 weeks. I mean, they consented to this in a study, and they found that it did increase well-being, mostly because people found that they had to do something else with that time. So there is some truth to this, right? That it's not always the best use of our time, but they were also more disconnected from what was going on. And so I think the main takeaway from this is that it's easy to say we just need to leave social media, but it also really depends on your network. I know personally, and this is very anecdotal, but at times when I've taken social media breaks, I realized, well, but if all my friends are posting their updates on social media and not messaging me about them, then I start to miss out. That's maybe a bigger problem, and we need to figure out how to communicate around that, but that is a reality. If your network is communicating on social media, your leaving doesn't automatically give you better well-being, depending on how you're communicating with those people. So it's kind of mixed, not surprisingly, but it's not all bad. That said, that's mostly focused on adults, and adults are adults, we're fully developed. We have, probably learned a lot of our social skills or work skills or school skills before getting into social media, right? But of course, now people are growing up with social media. So it is very different. We have to be clear on that. It is very different to be in, elementary school and already have pressure to be on social media than it is to be an adult and say, oh, I guess I'll sign up for this site and see what's going on. So those are admittedly different things. And I think with teenagers is where we're still figuring out the most. With adults, we can say, you know what, we have a lot of answers. But with teens, with that really developmental phase is where we still don't know quite as much. So generally, any of these impacts are going to be stronger on teenagers because they're still developing. So most things are going to have a stronger impact on them, and social media will be one of those things. So we do, again, have some key points. We do know it is a reality that things like being on Instagram and seeing, again, here comes the selective self-presentation, right? Seeing people with retouched, filtered, beautified, enhanced types of Instagram posts does lead to worse body image. And that's a major thing that does need to be tackled right now. How are teens looking at the kind of information that is not totally realistic, that maybe gives them a false impression of how other people get to live their lives or how other people look. So we do know that is a known negative effect. There was a lot of concern about cyberbullying. I have seen this, at least in research, kind of shift. And what it's found is that absolutely it exists, of course, just as bullying existed offline. But research keeps finding that teens are actually more pro-social than antisocial. That doesn't mean that no one's causing problems, but that most of them are using it for more positive ways than negative, fortunately. So that's a nice finding. When teens can use this to present themselves, it can be linked to better self-esteem. Of course, this has to be done in kind of a careful way, and I'll get to that in a moment. And I wanted to put this link in here. I don't know if there's a way to share the presentation slide itself. There was a new study just in April from Pew Research, who does a lot of research on just the state of things and how we use technology. And they did a really in-depth report on how teens are using social media right now. So kind of as 2023. And so some of those key updates were things like that they tend to have more positive things to say about it than negative. And that the main things that they have to navigate around are some of these sort of, the way that you present yourself. But it's a really interesting link. So I encourage you, if I can share this, to look at that for kind of the most up-to-date summary of what's happening in this space. So what can we do? So we have a lot of this complicated research. We know that it's not perfect, our use on social media, but it's maybe also not as negative as we tend to think. The main thing we find is, and a lot of people who focus on kind of practical ways to use social media, what we find is to think about this idea of mindfulness. And mindfulness is sort of just this ability to become really aware of what we're doing in the moment. Again, when we think about this sort of active use of social media versus that more passive use, a lot of it comes down to, why are we there and what are we doing? And some of my own research, and this is just a brief snapshot, has found that the more that we can kind of regulate ourselves in terms of how we use social media, the better our well-being is. So it's not necessarily about, if I, flip back, we see this, these phones are showing screen time. And again, you can let me know in the chat if you ever use this screen time feature. What the screen time feature is on this left here, you can see it shows you how much you're using your phone, how much you're using different apps. And so for a while, there was a big focus on if we just get people to use their phone less, we'll be better off. And we found that that's not necessarily true. There's not so much evidence that just using your phone less is better. And so what my research has found is that it's really more about how you regulate that time. So if you use screen time in a mindful way to say, I want to be on this app less, I don't want to use this during the day, there are really key tools that you can use to control that. But there are also other ways of regulating, right? Not taking your phone into certain rooms, or, being more intentional about how you do something. So why am I opening this app right now? Did I want to contact someone? Did I want to look something up? So there's all different types of strategies, and I'm happy to talk about that more, but this is one key thing that we see. So it's not just, I need to not be here, I need to use it less, but just this mindfulness, being more intentional in how we use it. So that's more for adults. For kids and for teens, obviously, again, coming back to this idea that they are not adults, they maybe don't have all of the developmental abilities that adults do. The main thing that really makes a difference is parental mediation. And I'll put a little asterisk on parental because it could also be another adult that's in the family or an adult that the child trusts. I don't think it has to be parents specifically, but that's the context it's been studied in. And so there's these different areas of parental mediation that have been studied over time. And so the kind of the strictest one is called restrictive mediation. And this is often what we think of in terms of, oh, we need to control social media for children. So this is, having rules, maybe not allowing phone use, not allowing certain apps to be on the phone, and so on. Co-viewing, this actually comes more from television. So if you sit down and watch a TV show with your kid, then that can have some effects with social media. Maybe it's you use the social media app with them. And then the active mediation is more about this kind of intervening and talking to children about their media experiences. And research finds that this is consistently the most effective way of reducing negative effects of media. So that was true for television, for movies, and they're finding more and more research that it's true for social media as well. So when we think about what to do about these effects and how to make this experience the most positive for kids and teens, it's really about having an adult, a guardian, somebody sort of be actively involved and say things like, for instance, if you're on Instagram, hey, you know that a lot of these pictures are manipulated and that these people probably don't look like that. Or, hey, you know that you're just viewing this one really great experience this person had, but they probably also have some negative experiences that they're not showing, right? So just kind of stepping in and reminding kids and teens of these things, which may seem obvious to us, but are not always obvious to them. So that's the biggest takeaway, I think, in terms of what we can do to mitigate some of these potential effects for now, right? We're all still figuring this out. So on a bigger scale, that was kind of individual effects, and I focused on well-being because that tends to be the main thing we're focused on. When we think about societal effects, so what about on the grand scale? What about when we talk about all of society, the US in general, certain populations? Again, there are so many effects we could think of, but the thing that we've really focused on over the last several years is misinformation. That's been a big one, right? So fake news, misinformation, disinformation, and then also polarization. So news or political polarization, right? We have a lot of ideas, I think, right now about how much social media is contributing to how polarized we are politically. And that, again, is something that we're really trying to figure out. What is the role of social media in that specifically? So this is where a lot of my research is. And again, I'll just highlight a few key things, but I'm happy to have more of a conversation about this. So just some baseline info. Many of us do get our news on social media. So just kind of starting from that. So we see, this chart here. This is from Pew Research. And so we would say, well, this is a thumbs up, right? So you're on social media. In most of these spaces, you're getting news. So if we think about the idea that we want the public to be informed, well, if they're going to spend time on social media, at least they're getting information. They're getting current events information. So we see, for Facebook, about half the people who are on Facebook are using it for news. Twitter, a lot of those people are using it for news. We see Reddit, LinkedIn, the numbers go down a little bit. But on every platform, they're using it for news to some extent. The downside is, and this may or may not be surprising, is that people on social media are less informed. So I should back up, not just people on social media. The more you use social media for your news, the less informed you actually are. So if we look at this chart, we look at something, it's, the way this is broken down is the darkest color, sort of high political knowledge, and then middle and then low political knowledge by different media type. So if you mostly get your news on a news website, which we would think is probably the most direct way, right, straight from the news source, they tend to have the highest political knowledge. Then you go down radio, print, cable TV, network TV, social media is almost at the bottom. So in terms of political knowledge, right, so if you're getting most of your news from social media, you have much lower political knowledge. The only thing that's lower than local TV than that is local TV. And I think that's more so because with local TV, we just see a different type of content, which is very important still. But something like a local Connecticut news station is maybe not reporting on the same types of things as national news that we would see elsewhere. So it's just a little bit different of a medium. So we would say that's probably a thumbs down, right? So why is this happening? Excuse me. So one really important thing we need to remember is who's putting this content in our feed. And so if we rewind back to the start, I had said the algorithms, right, are determining a lot of what's in our social media feed. But where does this content come from? So again, imagine, this is you right here. You've opened Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. It almost doesn't matter, right? You open some social media app and there's a feed that greets you with content. So where's that content coming from? So when we think about news content specifically, which is what a lot of the debate is about on social media, yes, some of it comes straight from journalists. So we have trusted journalists from local news stations, national news stations, newspapers, weather, meteorologists, sportscasters, all of these people, right? So these are providing generally credible content, but they're just one aspect of your newsfeed. You're also getting things from promoters. So people who are trying to sell things, right? So we see ads, we see people trying to boost content. We see people trying to influence you in some way. So it's already muddling a little bit of what we see just from journalists. Other users. Social media is nothing without other users. So if you go into Twitter and say, I'm going to see what the news is, again, great. You might see some news from newspapers, and you're also going to see a lot of things from just other people on the site. And these can be total strangers. They can be random people that you don't know, but their content is going to show up in your feed just the same way as that from journalists. Again, also the people trying to sell you something. And then you also get your friends. And our friends, if we're using social media to connect with our friends, great. But depending on what they're posting, they could also be sharing misinformation, or they could be sharing, certain types of content and not others. So we have these 4 different sources. And then, like I said at the start, we have the algorithm, which on top of this is kind of mixing up who is showing what in your feed from where and what is their goal, right? Because the goals of all these people are different too. Journalists, that goal is mostly going to be to get you that information. Promoters, now, if they're trying to sell you something that's a little bit different. Other users could have any number of goals. Your friends could have any number of goals. So our feeds are a combination of all these things. So you can imagine that while journalism might be fact-checked, might have, what we call gatekeeping, there's editors, all of these other sources are kind of free game. So we're seeing all kinds of content. And what we find, unfortunately, so this is a place where we really do see more of a negative effect that I think we're trying to figure out. Social media algorithms do amplify misinformation, meaning that unfortunately, and this is one of the downsides of algorithms, is that they get trained by machines what to focus on. And unfortunately, misinformation gets a lot of attention. Sometimes it's because people think it's real and they want to reshare it. Sometimes it's because people know it's fake and that's why they share it to try to, say, warn other people. Sometimes people share it to make fun of it. Sometimes people share it to make sarcastic remarks around it. It's a joke, right? There's all kinds of reasons people share misinformation. And the problem is that makes it more popular. And the algorithm sees that and says, oh, great, this is a popular piece of information. I'm going to keep throwing it more and more in people's feed. So this chart is just kind of showing the sort of predicted engagement of any type of content. This was specifically for kind of what's allowed on social media and what's not. And so social media apps do often have guidelines that say if something is really harmful, we're going to try to keep that off the site. But if somebody's just exaggerating, so they're in this kind of hyperbole, that's fine, right? They're not trying to tell you that it's true when it's not. They're just exaggerating. They're maybe making a joke. They're just, I lost my train of thought on exactly that, but the hyperbole, right? It's not totally meant to harm you. So that tends to be allowed. Harmful misinformation is often not allowed, right? If it's actively harming somebody, like their health or their safety. But there's a lot of this in-between misinformation that gets through. So this is a very real problem that we are trying to figure out. I have a bit of good news. One of the concerns is that this misinformation is a lot of what's polarizing us politically. There is evidence that politically we are more polarized. That part is true, right? So people on the right and people on the left are more and more on the right and left. There is evidence for that. The concern is that it's social media that's causing that. And just end of last week, I saw this story, and I did look at these studies that they refer to. So there's these 4 new studies that researchers did. These are in top journals like Nature and Science, which is where we tend to think our best research goes. And the researchers actually found that, yes, the algorithm does have influence in terms of what people see, but they found, fortunately, that it didn't actually change their attitudes that much. There are some caveats, so people who are in specific political pockets are exposed to only certain types of information and maybe are also more focused on those types of information. But for the most part, most people, even though they see a lot of this content, what they found mostly was that people weren't really resharing it that much. So it comes into their feed, the algorithm says, here's what we think you want to see, but a lot of people just don't really engage with it that much. And in this case, that's a good thing, right? So they're not engaging very heavily in the stuff that is potentially polarizing and that is maybe very politically driven to one agenda or another. So as this little clipping says, there's no silver bullet to fixing the platforms, which I think is true of just about every issue that we see with social media. So it's still a complicated problem. We're still trying to figure out how do we stop misinformation? And a lot of my research has been on that, of how can we potentially label it or teach people about it? And a lot of things are just very difficult to implement, partly for this reason, that people are exposed to a lot of content. They don't necessarily engage with it. So sometimes that's problematic. And in this case, that's actually potentially kind of helpful. So this was a late breaking kind of useful thing to discover. So hopefully more conversation about that as well. So I'm going to end with just one slide of what can we do? Even just that, 40 minutes of my talking may have been overwhelming, right? There's a lot going on individually, societally. There's a lot of platforms to pay attention to. There's a lot changing all the time. What can we do? So I have, again, these kind of 3 takeaways that from my own research and reviewing the research and having researched social media for over 15 years, at least right now, what I think are the most important things that we can just feasibly do as social media users. So first off, I would say be an active communicator. Again, this is if you choose to be on social media. If you choose not to be on social media, that is also perfectly acceptable. But let's say you're on social media and you say, oh, I keep hearing there's these problems, or I'm worried about this, but you want to be there. What can you do? So I would say be an active communicator, not just a passive information consumer. That's where we tend to see those well-being effects, right? If you're just scrolling through, you can get lost in that spiral of everyone's doing things and I'm not doing things, or I'm seeing all this information and I don't know what to do with it, right? That's where we tend to get, so we call it doom scrolling, right? Everything is sort of doom and gloom because we've just kept scrolling. So the more that you go in and are a more active communicator, you know, do you message someone? Do you share something? Do you start a conversation within whatever bounds make sense to you? But we tend to find that that has more positive and less negative effects. I would say move away from getting your news on social media. We just keep seeing problems there in terms of how informed people are, just because it is so filtered through your own network, through the algorithm, that often we can kind of miss what the real information is, what the big picture is, given that misinformation can spread so easily. I would say, you know, if you are looking to follow the news, certainly maybe turning back to news websites, newspapers, and so on. And social media sites have kind of shifted in how much they're showing this content. So they're, of course, realizing the same thing. But I would say move away from getting onto Twitter to see what the news is for the day, for instance. But do find a way instead to maybe use it as a way to connect with people. That tends to bring the most positive effects. And then finally, I think for yourself, this is that mindfulness piece, sort of identifying what the benefits are for you from social media and sort of prioritizing those. So I know for me, I have a whole strategy in, you know, how I use different platforms, and I probably use them more, of course, as a social media researcher, but that's why I had to set these boundaries for myself, because I could be on all of them all day, and that's not good for me either. So identifying, why should I be on Twitter? Why should I be on Instagram? Why should I be on Facebook? What am I going to do when I get there? And what are the things I don't want to do there? What are the things I don't want to see in my feed? What are the ways I don't want to engage? Because I know that they're not good for me. So that's the third kind of overall encompassing. So I will, as I say to my students, I will stop talking now, and I'm certainly curious to hear your questions if you have any. I'll flip to this slide just in case anybody needs to head out or wants to email me. So if you don't want to ask a question now, so you can find me on Twitter, although that icon is outdated now that it's X. There's my email, and then there's my website if you wanted to see more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. I'm just putting your email in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what's going on with Twitter and what you think is going to happen.
Yeah, in any specific respect or just kind of generally?
Generally, if I don't know how much people know about it, but
Yeah.
just wondering what the future of it might be.
Yeah, so I guess long story short, so I mean, Twitter's been around for a long time, I think 2006, and it was always kind of this microblogging. You just say what you, little tweets that you send out to everyone, right? You get the news feed. And so recently Elon Musk bought Twitter, and has just had a very different vision for Twitter than what it was before. So people who were banned from the platform for having really harmful speech, so again, talking about, you know, truly harmful content that's on a platform not being allowed, those people are allowed again. There are a lot of changes to how people can communicate and what's shown to them. Just today, there was an article that now academics, so a lot of academics use Twitter to research things, so they can download Twitter data to see, oh, how do people communicate about an election? What are the tweets that people have sent about, you know, the climate crisis, those kinds of things. So now academics are actually being sued for studying that in any way that puts the Twitter in a negative light. So there's a lot of just confusion about things that are free speech that are problematic, but then things that are very restricted in ways that could be helpful for us to, say, study the platform. Yeah, so it was just renamed X. So there's a lot of controversy about that, a little bit more superficial controversy, but there's a lot going on. And honestly, we don't always know what's going on because it's very erratic. So one thing that's been happening is a lot of, at least in the academic community, a lot of people have been leaving Twitter, even though it was a major platform for networking with other academics, and are trying to find other platforms to go to now.
Does anyone have any questions or comments just about your own social media use? Anything you've been wondering about? One question in the chat, do you have any thoughts about how AI might impact social media?
Yeah, so that's kind of the next big question. So AI or artificial intelligence, especially recently, we've developed, I mean, not me, but more powerful tools have been developed for things like text, for instance. So you can go to, you may have heard of like ChatGPT. So it's sort of an AI chatbot. You can go in and ask it anything and it will generate content for you. So you can say, I just joked around this morning a little bit. I said, write me a poem about August, and it wrote me a poem. And then I can say, okay, but write me a slightly different poem, and it'll write me a different poem. That's pretty innocuous. But of course, one thing, of course, will be misinformation, right? We're already discovering that AI, because it's just learning based on the text that it's seen online, just makes up facts. So if you ask, about a history question, what happened in this particular war, or why is this a holiday, or what happened on this day, AI will I saw somebody say, AI will very confidently be wrong. So it will come up with an answer for you and it will sound great. And there will be no way to tell that it's wrong unless you already know that it's wrong. So that'll be that's one major concern, is further spread of misinformation. And then we also have visual AI, in that you can create images that are not real, that are all just artificially created. So you can create images of things that don't exist, that never happened. And we're seeing that also into video now. So there's a video called deepfake. So you can take, say, a video of the president and have it look like he's the one saying something in his voice, but it'll be something that he never said. People are also using AI with voices now. I just saw recently that certain artists, their voices were fed into machine learning, and then songs were created using those artists' voices that the artists had nothing to do with. So it sounds like a song coming from this musician, but they never recorded it, but AI had their voice recorded. So mostly I think it's going to be, the biggest problem I think is going to be misinformation. The benefit, that's a good question, if there's a benefit. I'm trying to think of what the benefit would be in the social media space specifically. There's a lot of ways that AI can be a useful tool individually, but on social media, the concern, of course, is the misinformation.
Would you be able to go back to that slide and link out to the Pew Research, just so I could put the link in the chat?
Yeah.
Or just go to it online and I can grab it.
Yeah, I'll probably have to pull the link from here. I don't have it. Oops. This one, the team one. Yeah. So if I open it, I can put the link in the chat.
Great, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions anyone has? All right, so yes, you can go to this link. I can also share it later with all of you, as well as her information. All right, if there are no other comments or questions, I want to thank you so much for being here, Anne. This was an excellent presentation. We have some comments to that very fact in the chat. Great presentation and excellent. So thank you very much for sharing your information and your research with us. Really, really helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.